Okay, so I wanted to establish a little bit of situational awareness. So, that's you on the left side of the screen. That's beer. And unfortunately, that's me. That's between you and the beer. So it's not that I don't know this to be true. Quick show of hands. How many people here consider themselves to be fluent in English? Most of you. I'm going to try to talk slower than I usually do so that more of you can understand, because if you can't understand, then there's no point in me being up here, right? Okay, we're going to start a little bit with Zizek. He is a continental philosopher. He is a Marxist, and he says, design is the apparatus that directly materializes ideology. I am a designer. I'm a user experience designer, at least that's what I've been for about the last 15 years. Before I was a user experience designer, I wrote code, mostly Lisp, and right after I wrote a bunch of Lisp for a software company that was fantastic, amazing. We were filled with brilliant people, and we failed utterly. We collapsed. There was nothing left of it. And after that, I went and hid for 4 years inside of IBM, and I wrote Java. At the time, there was really no such thing as user experience designer. I kind of drifted from a Java developer into an information architect, into a UX designer, and now I'm mostly responsible for organization design. So there's kind of a very interesting thing, and it will be a pattern that repeats itself throughout my talk, this notion of self-similarity, or what I would like to call fractal nature of design. That is, I was responsible and excited about designing products that customers would use. But then I realized that things were pretty shitty. So then I started getting more interested in the design of teams that designed products that customers used. And I realized that for the most part, that was also pushing a large stone uphill constantly. And so I moved up to departments, functional areas, and now I'm mostly responsible for the design of entire value streams within large organizations. To give you an example of the scale, one of my clients that I'm working with right now, they're about 130,000 people. They have 3 large data centers, one in the United States, one in Singapore, one in Belgium. And it's a rather massive undertaking. So when I think in terms of designing for scale, I'm thinking about how do we design systems so that people who work within those systems can be both happy and productive and effective, and be able to deliver effectively 10,000 VMs to the cloud with relatively little pain. So one definition of design, this comes from a good friend of mine. He's actually my business partner as well. He says it's the intentional formation of a purposeful system. So when I think about design, it's not necessarily about what you usually think about. For instance, really, really attractive products made by like Apple, or before that, because they ripped most of their designs off from a German company. But what I think about when I think about design is what's called fourth order design, which is the design of the systems that then design the teams that then design the products that customers ultimately use. So I'm gonna start, hopefully, with a few assumptions, and I wanted to be very explicit about my assumptions, and I wanted to share them with you, so that when I make some rather outrageous claims later on, you can at least check either my logic, or you can call my bullshit. So, yes, I curse a lot. I apologize. Assumption number 1, we all exist within some system. So, does anybody challenge this? I'm going to get into what I define as a system in a few seconds. Assumption number 2, we are all responsible for the design, development, or maintenance of systems that create value. Hopefully. Hopefully we're working on stuff that creates value for somebody. Assumption number 3, we are in this to create. I'm assuming that most of the people that are here are engineers, developers, programmers. Are there any UX designers in the house? 1. I know there's another. You're hiding somewhere. If you're not hiding in this room, I know you're taking bong hits out back, right? Okay, specifically, we are in this to create value. That is to create things that people will value because it enables them to do things that they value. Corollary, if you are in this gig, if you are an engineer, developer, designer, if you are in this just to make money, fuck you. Assumption number 4, there is value in creating new things. There is value in innovation. And my final assumption is this: agile and/or lean UX affords us better ways of creating new things of value. Things like real-time analytics, small sprints to ship value as quickly as possible to the customer feedback, it's actually in the Agile Manifesto, incremental and iterative, that is, what is the smallest unit of value that we can ship as quickly as possible and get feedback from our customers so we know whether we're on the right track or not. As opposed to what I used to do, which is spend 3 to 6 months writing the most beautiful, amazing, well-annotated requirements documents that nobody had ever read. So here, quickly, is the Agile Manifesto. Is this new to anybody? Have most people read this? The interesting thing about it is the second word. It's a manifesto. Manifestos are inherently political. In fact, manifestos are inherently violent. They are about the overthrow of existing power systems that exist between human beings in the way that we do what we do. Recently, there's a new manifesto. It's called the Lean Product Management Manifesto. It was written by a woman named Melissa Perry. She is very well known in the lean startup, lean UX community. She's spoken at a number of different conferences. She's very, very, very smart, very articulate, and this is what she has to say: customer problems and needs over internal requirements, data-driven experiments over preconceived notions, customer problem roadmaps over feature roadmaps, idea generation and collaboration over solution mandates. So it's interesting that we go from things like the Communist Manifesto, or an even more violent version of that came out of Italy back in the 19-teens, 1920s, called the Futurist Manifesto, and we get to these new ones that are about literally the overthrow of existing power structures. Mostly the overthrow of existing functional departments, hierarchies, and the way that decisions are made in large organizations about how we do what we do so that hopefully we deliver some value to the customer more than just picking up a paycheck every couple of weeks or every month. And so this begins, and this is an interesting thing that I've noticed. We have all these things like RUP, which most people call waterfall. It's interesting that in most original arguments about why Agile was a good thing, the first thing you need to do when you're creating a new community is you need to create an other, right? You need to create an enemy. You need to demonize that enemy, and that enemy is waterfall. So that's what we did. We also have a bunch of other ones. We have Prince2, we have the Interaction Design Association, we have UPA, Usability Professionals Association, and on and on and on. And each one of these sprung up as a very small conference. That conference gained traction. It started to build a community. The community became a movement. The movement started to anoint high priests within that movement that would establish what the orthodox view of that movement should be. And it goes on and on and on, down to the more recent one, the Lean UX conference. Has anybody heard of Lean UX? Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of you. My only connection to it is I run the Lean UX conference in New York City. It's in its 4th year. It's relatively vibrant, and it's already morphing, because one of my fears is that it will become entrenched. It will start to establish its own orthodoxy, and pretty soon it will die. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about boundaries. This is a great line, paragraph that comes from this woman named Ursula Le Guin in a book called The Possessed. And she wrote, "There was a wall. It did not look important. It was built of uncut rocks roughly mortared. An adult could look right over it, and even a child could climb it. Where it crossed the roadway, instead of having a gate, it degenerated into mere geometry, a line, an idea of a boundary. But the idea was real. It was important. For 7 generations, there had been nothing in the world more important than that wall. Like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended upon which side of it you were on." And I think that this is really important to think about a little bit when we think about communities, when we think about conferences, when we think about practices, because oftentimes we start to erect walls. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what that might do. But before that, I wanted to talk about this talk itself, so get a little recursive on your asses. And that is this: I really, really think that oftentimes when we talk about the methods and the processes, basically the what and the how we do our work, whether you're an engineer or a designer or a product owner, whatever your role, it seems that we're always either being asked to or giving silver bullets. Sometimes senior managers want a silver bullet. They believe, and this is a senior executive, he was the vice president for enterprise architecture at a very large organization, and he said, Will, can you help us out? If we just brought in the DevOps, all of our problems would be solved. Like I had a bag filled with DevOps pixie dust that I was going to sprinkle all over them. And so the point is, we really don't know. Even though we've been doing this for a decent amount of time, we really don't know if there are indeed any silver bullets. But what I will tell you is this: I don't have any, but I will tell you what I'm trying, and sometimes it seems to work a little bit. One thing though, leaders of large organizations face this dilemma every single day, and I've heard this a number of times as it relates to bringing in Agile or bringing in Lean UX. They say, we really want to be innovative, but who else is doing it like this? Specifically, who else like us is doing this? And when you're talking, for instance, the sponsor of this conference, ABB, when you're a large multinational conglomerate, when you have over 100,000 employees, it's very interesting that you're looking around saying, we want to be innovative, but we want to make sure that other people are doing it first. And I want to dissuade us from that notion. We need to think beyond that, but we need to bound it. So when we think about boundaries, we need to clearly articulate, how are we going to bound our experimentation around org design or around product design? Because what I said at the very beginning, these things are fractal in nature. The other thing that I wanted to give you right up front is this: our knowledge can only be finite while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said this, and it leads directly to this notion of how do we know what we know? Because this is an important question to answer, especially when you're designing features or you're designing platforms. That is, how do you make the decisions that you make in your everyday life? And how do you know that it's the right decision, or do you know that it's the right decision? And are you justified in believing the things you believe when you make these decisions about a choice in technology, a choice in process, a choice in which customers to interview, a choice in which customers to test your new feature with, a choice in what kind of platform or what kind of an analytics package you're going to use? And the only thing that I can really offer you is a couple of models. And I'm going to state right up front this. Models, they can be skillful, but they all lie. All right? So they can be useful. They may help us understand the world around us. They may make it easier for us to make certain kinds of decisions, but we can't believe that they are in fact reality. They are nothing more than models of reality. This in particular is a model that comes from cybernetics. Has anybody heard of cybernetics? It's a really interesting story about a community that rose up, thought it had all the answers, and has subsequently died, or at least pivoted. It came about in the 1950s. What it did was it tried to apply the machine metaphor to the way that people, human beings, process information. And then it thought that by applying the machine metaphor to how human beings actually process information and make decisions, that it would learn enough so that it could apply it to artificial intelligence, which would allow us to then create artificial intelligent beings. We have not yet done that. So instead of cybernetics saying, hey, we give up, we must have failed, what they did was they just kind of like repackaged themselves, rebranded themselves, and now they're going after and talking about how to design social networks based on the ideas of cybernetics. That too will fail. So anyway, I will offer two models, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they might be useful or not. The first, I'm going to talk about complexity, sense-making, and heretics. And I made this very explicitly. Has anybody done any information science coursework in graduate school or elsewhere? So a little bit, you might have a little familiarity with sense-making. To understand that, there is a great quote from Cardinal Bellarmine in his letter to Foscarini, and this is a long time ago. This is back in 1615, and he said, "For to say that assuming the earth moves and the sun stands still, all the appearances are saved better than with eccentrics and epicycles, is to speak well. There is no danger in this, and it is sufficient for mathematicians. But to want to affirm that the sun really is fixed in the center of the heavens and only revolves around itself, that is, it turns on its axis, without traveling from east to west, and that the earth is situated in the third sphere and revolves with great speed around the sun, is indeed a very dangerous thing. He was writing this letter about Galileo, who ended up in jail because he wouldn't renounce it. And what he is essentially arguing in this letter is, if for rhetorical purposes you want to make certain assertions that will make it easier for your models to work mathematically, that's okay. But do not upset the accepted orthodox view about cosmology, because if you do that, we're going to toss your sorry ass in jail. That's really what he's saying in this. And this is one of the things that we face if, for instance, you have adopted certain things like Agile because you are on the cutting edge of exploring what we would call the unknown unknowns. That is, you are uncovering problems that maybe customers don't even know they have. And maybe if you're also doing process design, you might be uncovering new ways for people to work that people haven't thought about before. And the problem with that is you may get branded a heretic, and the problem with getting branded a heretic is you may end up hanged. So what is sense making? Really simply, it's an issue of language, talk, and communication. Situations, organizations, and environments are talked into existence. Sense-making is about the interplay of action and interpretation rather than the influence of evaluation on choice. And this is where it ties to information processing. This is a diagram that was created by this woman when she was getting her PhD at the University of Berkeley. Her name was Brenda Dervin. And she created this model, and she said, on the left-hand side is a person. And this person is seeking some kind of information. And there's actually 4 different types of information-seeking behavior that a person can go about. But let's assume that this person is doing what's called known item retrieval. That is, they know what they want. It may be a little bit fuzzy, but for the most part, they know what they want. They want a certain type of information. What she studied was how people retrieve that information from some kind of a software system. So a classic example of this, and this is going back to the 90s, is that you would enter some string of words, an act that she would call verbings. So you engage in this activity of entering some words, some keywords, maybe an entire sentence into a text editor box. You hit return, it sends it off to a smart machine. The smart machine parses it, right? It goes down through an entire list. It then reproduces that list. It sends it back to the browser. The user reads that list. And the interesting thing about it is that even if the list is shit, the list teaches the user a little bit more about the domain that they are trying to search within. And so what the user ends up doing is picking up little bits and pieces of information that allow them to do a better search the next time. So that the second time that they enter a search query into the same box, they use slightly different words, they get slightly better results back. And this is how the system and the user co-evolve together. So they co-evolve. The user understands the system better and the domain of the information, and the system understands a little bit more about the intent of the person. Another way to think about sense-making is it's our intentional, motivated, and continuous effort to understand connections, which can be among people, places, stories, objects, and events, and their interactions in order to anticipate their potentialities and then take action in the world in some purposeful direction. And so all of a sudden we introduce this new language about purpose, that humans have some intent to do something, and I'm using that word very specifically to echo something that Mr. Fowler said this morning about intentionality. That is, we intend something, we have a purpose, we have a goal, we are directed in some way or another. And sense-making is our act of understanding things and their interactions so that we can act with intent, with purpose. Alicia Guerrero, who is the professor emeritus of philosophy, says this: the meaning exists in the interactions between the things, not in the things themselves, which makes things very, very difficult when you have organizational processes like, for instance, performance evaluations, which are very, very interesting from my perspective. I don't know if they're from your perspective, but what they seek to do is assess your ability to perform, even though for you to actually achieve the purpose of your team, you actually need to collaborate. You need to work with other people. It's a very interesting kind of tension that exists there. So what she says is that the meaning exists in the interaction, not in the things themselves. And when she says the interaction of things, what she means is within a bounded system. So we should probably define what we mean. A system is any network that has bounded coherence. So an example of a network might be that has bounded coherence is if you go for a walk tomorrow morning, sometime before 7 a.m., there is a chance that you will see a spider web. And when you see that spider web, it may have a lot of dew on it, and it may be broken. But the key thing is it has enough coherence for you to be able to process it and do some simple pattern matching and recognize that it is, in fact, a spider web. So it is a network of interconnections that has coherence, meaning that when you see it, you're able to identify it as such. Now, Russell Ackoff, who's a great, one of the first big systems theorists, said, a system is not the sum of the behavior of its parts, it is the product of their interactions, which many people have probably heard something like this. You know, greater than the sum of its parts, something like that. And what this comes to mean, and we'll see this in a second, is that there are certain aspects of systems, and especially when I talk about systems, I'm talking not about software systems per se, but complex adaptive systems like teams within larger organizations, organizations within a larger community, communities inside of a larger, like a country or for instance, the EU. They're highly sensitive to small changes, and I don't mean the butterfly flapping its wings in Indonesia causing a hurricane off the coast of California. What I mean is that systems are inherently unstable and they are prone to small change or sensitive to small changes, but let's not get overboard here. Proximity and connectivity between the nodes inside of a system are really, really important. Meaning emergence through their interactions. We need to think more about the coalescence of nodes within the graph as opposed to categorization of things. And hindsight does not lead to foresight. So as soon as we start talking about a complex adaptive system, we can no longer predict what the output may be, which is very, very dissimilar from many of the software systems we design where we actually want the output to be predictable for the most part, right? Most of the time. So this is the interesting thing when we try to apply more systems thinking, like computational systems thinking to human organizations, is that some of the fundamental things have to change. Our thinking about it has to change because it is not necessarily predictive. And we need to shift our mindset from this notion of fail-safe, robust systems to safe-to-fail experimentation. An example of even how our current ecosystems are changing from fail-safe, robust systems. I don't know how many people have been programming for a long time, but 20 and 30 years ago, if you wanted to stand up a bunch of servers, chances are you were spending a lot of money with Sun. Nowadays, you're buying a lot of really, really cheap, off-the-rack commodity hardware, right? And you're actually designing the systems to fail. And in fact, you may introduce things like chaos engines to come in and randomly shut stuff down to cause people to think about the fact that they need to design for failure. They need to design from the assumption that some of your systems may go down at any point and you don't know which ones there are. When an observer chooses a particular scope of observation, and this is kind of important for understanding the way I'm framing this, he is in effect declaring his belief that the included items are important features. So when we start to talk about defining the system, we need to think about what are the boundaries, what is in and what is out. And this will actually change, this will bias the way we see things, but that's okay. The other thing to remember is an agent acts within a system. So an agent is anything that is able to act within the system, on the system, or with the system. So it could be a person, it could be an object, it could be a policy, it could be a story, it could be a taboo. It's anything that causes any kind of a change in the system or co-evolves with the system. Sometimes people usually like to think about agents within a larger complex adaptive system as, for instance, just people. And the problem with that is I've noticed in a lot of organizations, they have things like rumors. Rumors have agency within a complex adaptive system because they change and co-evolve with the people themselves. And this is important to keep in mind. There's a company that I worked with about 4 or 5 years ago, and the interesting thing is at all company events, during the day, after whatever company party, any of these events, there was no alcohol whatsoever. And at one point I finally said, hey, this is kind of strange, and we're a software company and nobody drinks. And they're like, oh, no, we drink. We just don't drink on company time or in anything related to a company event. And once we went out and we started drinking, I got the whole story, and the story was this. The founder of the company was a woman from Georgia back in the United States, and she was very prim and proper. And she married this guy who was initially really brilliant and helped her co-found the company, but eventually he developed an alcohol problem, which caused him to do some erratic things, one of which was one day he decided to fire everybody in the company. Sent around an email saying, you're all fired. People were like, what? What's going on? But they took it at face value. The next day, everybody got an email at like 7 o'clock in the morning that says, if you want your job, show up at 8 a.m., line up, and you all have to reapply for your jobs, which is absolutely insane. Apparently, he had sobered up and realized what he had done. After that, that story spread throughout the company, and nobody ever drank at another company event, because they were afraid that they would get fired because of Mrs. Murphy. She had that kind of an impact on the company. So that's an example of how a story, a rumor, can spread within an organization, within a system, and it has agency. It changes things. But the other thing we need to think about with complex adaptive systems like organizations or teams is that we need to understand that they are bounded by constraints. There are constraints on the system. So we need a quick definition of complex adaptive systems from a constraints perspective. So Alicia, again, says this, and she focuses mostly on complexity theory as it applies to innovation within software companies. Just as the constraints of syntax allow meaning to be expressed, constraints on behavior thus make meaningful actions possible. So what she's saying is that constraints aren't necessarily always bad. Like usually when you think about a constraint, you might think about the restrictive form of a constraint. Like you can't go out after dark. Or when I was a kid, my parents had constraints on me like I needed to be home by 11 p.m. But there are other constraints that actually enable positive action. They allow us to do good stuff. So what she calls enabling constraints, and I'll give you an example of it. This is a quote from Umberto Eco. He was a European writer. He was a linguist. Some people might know him more for some of the books that he wrote. Name of the Rose is one of them. Foucault's Pendulum is another book that he wrote. And he said this: a text is a place where the irreducible polysemy of symbols is in fact reduced because a text symbols are anchored in their context. That is, you only understand the meaning of a word when it is situated inside of another sentence, which is situated inside of a paragraph. And this is very similar to the way other things inside of complex systems are also situated and how they gain their meaning. So I'm going to give you 4 quick examples that will lead to one of these models. Here's the first example, and I'm going to give you about 5 seconds to read it. Are you ready? Yeah? All right, here's the first example. Give up? All right, here's the second example. Has anybody read this before? This is from Ginsberg, The Howl, famous beat poet from New York. Here's the third example. And here's the fourth sample that is near and dear to my heart. So here are 4 examples that you've now just seen where the application of a simple constraint, which is grammar, actually constrains the what was seemed at first complete randomness. That is all those words, and believe me, it took a long time for me to write a couple of paragraphs that was complete gibberish, because we are pattern-making human beings, which means that it is a natural inclination for us to try to make words mean something. So it took a while before I could make something that meant absolutely nothing. The first example I shared with you, there were no constraints. There was no grammar, there was no syntax. In the second one, I started to apply light constraints. So the example that I pulled, Ginsberg's The Howl, there are light constraints. It's still not quite as rigid as some other forms of poetry. So for instance, a sonnet is a highly constrained form of poetic device. But still, what is interesting about Ginsberg is how he had very, very light constraints, but they were still meaningful. And if you read it, you would see that some meaning emerges from it. The third example, very, very, much stronger constraints are placed on this because it's a technical manual. This example, number 3. So this is meant for a very specific audience. It knows who its audience is, and it uses very tightly constrained grammar to be able to teach something or to express something. And the final one is the most constrained example, where syntax is used to define exactly what is going on. In this example, it's for making a cup of coffee. And so what this really leads to is that there are 3 types of systems, which you can see very quickly. The first is what we would call an ordered system. An ordered system is very deterministic. The system constrains the agents. It's about reductionism and rules. It's deterministic, meaning that you can predict the output given any input. And finally, it is observer independent. That is, it doesn't matter who you are, it still has the exact same meaning over and over and over again. Now, as you look at the second 2 examples, I want you to think a little bit about organizations. The second one, chaotic. Agents are unconstrained and independent of each other. So they are completely unconstrained. There are no rules. There is no syntax. There is no grammar. And then finally, the third one is complex. That is, system lightly constrains the agents. Agents are able to modify the system, and this is a new thing, by their interactions with it and with each other, and they co-evolve. Now, the interesting thing and how this applies to most organizations is that if I sit down to write a requirements document, inherent in that act of writing, I am assuming that it is a relatively ordered system. That is, I can almost perfectly, or at least I'm assuming that I can almost perfectly predict exactly what system I need to build, who I need to build it for, how I need to build it, how it will scale for an infinite number of users, on what kind of platforms it will perform forever. And that's what was one of the problems with requirements documents, at least the ones that we used to write back in the 90s, is that we assumed all of this stuff, which is really interesting because of the number of times we utterly failed. So an order system is a system constrains the agents and it's very deterministic. In a chaotic, everything is unconstrained. It is indistinguishable from white noise. And in a complex system, the most interesting one, agents are lightly constrained and agents co-evolve. So there's this mutual influence. And some of the interesting things are that hindsight does not lead to foresight. In fact, meaning only emerges and then you can make sense of it after the fact. Something that we call retrospective coherence. It makes sense in hindsight, but you could have never predicted it from the beginning. And this is where we actually need to focus on fail-safe design of our systems, not or from fail-safe design to safe-to-fail experimentation. And this is where places like Agile and Lean Startup tend to be more appropriate, which is interesting because safe-to-fail experiments aren't the only types of development jobs that we have. They're not the only types of engineering that we do. It is one aspect to it. Certainly when we're designing a brand new thing from the ground up, we are exploring the unknown unknowns. We may not know completely about their customer, completely about what their needs are. We may not understand how the system and the human will interact with one another. So in those places, those methodologies may be completely appropriate. The question is, are they appropriate in all places at all times? And so this is really leading up to a very simple framework that was created in IBM by a guy named Dave Snowden. I'm going to present that and then I'm going to move on really quickly. Has anybody heard of the Cynefin framework? Maybe a few people. So what he's talking about here is he says when you're talking about any domain, any problem space, you really need to divide the world into an ordered and an unordered system. So on the left-hand side, he has the ordered system that is a relatively deterministic system, on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, you have a non-deterministic system. And he says for each one of these domains, you first need to understand where you are, and then you need to know how to act appropriately. So if we're talking about the obvious domain, a purely deterministic ordered system, we need to be able to sense what is going on there, categorize things, and then respond appropriately. This is the place where all of a sudden rule books or standard operating procedures make a lot of sense. When he's talking about the top right domain, the domain of complicated, what it means is it's the domain of known unknowns. That is, it is knowable. There are causal relationships. You may not know it, but somebody does. This is really the place where you want to bring in an expert. So if you have what's called a known unknown, that is, causal relationships may be there, but you can't see it because you're not an expert at it, but you may want to bring somebody in who is an expert. And you really only want to do an experimentation in the complex domain. That is where you want to probe, sense, and respond. That is, run experiments, see how the system reacts to you, and then from there make decisions about how you're going to scale up. So one of the interesting things is that when you're thinking about software development, imagine the times in which you're starting off and you want to explore, you want to find out new things. Maybe you have a startup idea or you have a brand new feature and you don't know how it's going to interact with the environment. What you want to do is you want to design small, safe-to-fail experiments, but you're not going to make any money there. This isn't a system that is actually robust. This is not one that could handle 10,000 concurrent users. And what you want to eventually do is apply more and more constraints as you scale out until you move it over either into the complicated or into the simple or the obvious domain. So there's this notion of movement between domains, but it's intentional movement. You're designing this thing with intentionality to do experimentation first before you think in terms of scaling. And I think back to the number of startups that failed back in the 90s, and I was with a couple of them. I think out of the 5 startups that I was with, only 1 actually succeeded, is that we often assume that the world is ordered, and so we make these massive bets. We borrow or we get VC funding for $100 million. We spend that, we build out a massively scalable system, coming to realize that nobody actually wants the thing. It doesn't solve a problem that is interesting. And only once in a while do we actually do the experiments, find a place where all of a sudden the customer likes it, or they interact with it, and they're like, hey, this is kind of cool. And then you build upon that. And a lot of the startups that failed in the late 90s back in the United States failed because they got way too much funding, they scaled out a massive system, they hired a bunch of really great marketing people that spent most of their time drinking, they burned through $100 million, and all of a sudden they went under. So it's this notion of like, what is your context? What is the situation? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And what is the smallest you can do before you think in terms of scaling out? So this leads directly to the next piece, which is this. The technology adoption route for IT departments is this: ignore, prevent, tolerate, allow, and integrate. And I've noticed this over and over and over when we're making decisions about the systems that we're building. And it kind of it reminds me of this thing from Gary Klein. He said, in many cases, the problem isn't about having or noticing insights. It is about acting on them. The organization lacks the willpower to make decisions and act, and I've seen this over and over and over again. And this is how it really plays out in a lot of larger companies, especially the companies that come and hire me, is when it comes to a new technology or a new methodology or a new way of doing work, what they tend to do is they ignore until they can't really ignore any longer. And then they say, oh, fuck, right? And then they say, we're moving everything to the cloud. And they're like, we're going to be totally different. We're going to move everything to the cloud. Yeah, but everybody else moved there 5 years ago. But the key thing is they make the decisions when it's way too late because they don't have the situational awareness. And so what I wanted to introduce this notion of moving from strategy to decision-making. So strategy is fundamentally about making choices about why we're doing something. Why are we designing and building something? That is, why should we doing one thing as opposed to doing another thing? And it often needs to precede the what and the how. And way too often, and I see this quite a bit, especially on Twitter, especially at the conferences I go to, whether it's DevOps Days or the Agile Alliance Conference, or any one of these things, is that people get so passionate about the methods. They get really passionate about TDD. They get really passionate to the exclusion of everything else. It's like, you're not doing Scrum right. I don't know if anybody's heard this before, but I've heard this before quite a bit. Or you're estimating, or you're not estimating. Oh my God, no estimates becomes a hashtag, and then somebody's writing a book about it. We're so excited and focused about how we do our work, we forget why are we doing this thing that we're doing in the first place. And so this notion of strategy really requires that we have a map. Before we can understand why to do one thing versus another, it's helpful to understand where we are and where we are in the context of where everybody else is and where do we want to go. And so this guy, really smart guy, who was responsible for the strategy at Ubuntu, came up with a thing called value chain mapping. What he did is on the left axis, he basically said, how visible is this thing to the customer? That is, to the end user. And on the right-hand side, he showed evolution of a thing. And an example that he gave is, say you wanted to make a cup of tea. At the end of the day, your customer only cares about sipping the cup of tea, nothing really else. And he did this thing called feature injection, which I believe was coined by a guy named Chris Matz. And it says, okay, for a cup of tea, what do you need? Well, you need tea, and you need hot water. Well, what do you need for hot water? Well, you need water, of course, and you're going to need some kind of a heating element, and besides that, you're going to need electricity. So you're going to need all these components to make the tea. And what he was really talking about here was that we need to be able to componentize the things that we're doing, or the pieces in our stack, whatever our technology stack is. And then we need to identify what is the best thing that we can do for each component, and how are things going to play out over time in terms of evolution. And so he showed that on the left-hand side is really about chaos in terms of the evolution of a thing, for instance, a component inside of a technology stack. So it's chaotic, unpredictable, changing, different, exciting. And on the right-hand side, this is really when you get into the industrialization of a thing. And so it may be more rigid, may be known, measured, stable, standard, dull, low margin, but essential. So this is when we're talking about things like our data center needs to be up all the time. We need to have a disaster recovery plan in place. We need to be able to recover all our data if we lose it. So I wanted to show what this looks like. This is an actual map for a technology stack for digital consumer for a very large company, a very large healthcare company. And it shows all the components that would go into a digital consumer platform for this particular company and all the things that underlie that. And the interesting thing, and this wraps right back around to Agile here, is that for stuff in the top left-hand corner, it's really more appropriate to be thinking about Agile methodologies. This is where they're very strong, because you're talking about small, highly collaborative teams with small sprints, which means that there's low investment, not a lot of risk, and constantly shipping and testing stuff with the customers. The thing is, for things like large industrial data centers, you actually care about things like Lean Six Sigma. That is reducing variability in output. In fact, you want the same consistent output all the time. And I'm not going to go so far as to say automate all the things, but you certainly want to automate a lot of things. And so all of a sudden you can see that certain methodologies make sense in the top left quadrant, or in the Cynefin framework, we would be talking about in the complex domain, but other methodologies like Agile or Lean may not make sense when you're talking about keeping a data center up and running all the time. We need to be able to apply the right mindset, the right thinking process at the right place. The other things I just added in the top left-hand corner are things like lean UX and design thinking, because they're talking about constantly going and talking to your customers and doing what's called abductive ideation. In the center tends to be things like throw up a Kanban board and be able to manage your flow, right? Visualize your work, see everything in process. Another way to think about it is this: what do you do if you're caught in one of these domains? In the top left-hand corner, it's really about exploration. So you want to be able to probe, sense, and respond. In the middle, it's really about productizing things or buying things. So it may make more sense to just go out and buy the thing. And in the bottom, this is where you actually want to exploit economies of scale. And so this is where things like outsourcing make sense. Or, fuck it, we're not even going to do any kind of an infrastructure play. We're just going to have AWS do it all, right? Another way to think about it is this. We're looking at the probable, plausible, and possible things that you could build, and then all the various ways in which you could make decisions about how to do that thing, so that you're at least doing the right thing for the right reason. And this is very similar to what's called the Three Horizons model. What I did was I flipped it backwards and then put it on top of the Wordley map, so you can see in the top left-hand corner, Horizon 3, these are the places where you want to be investing, but making small investments. So what you're doing is not investing a ton, you're exploring, you're trying a lot of things, you're testing constantly. Whereas in the middle horizon, this is more in your immediate time frame between 1 and 2 years. You really want to be moving things more towards some kind of product. So you want to be making sure that it's scalable, that it's relatively robust. In the thing in the very shorthand, so the horizon one, it's really about exploitation. It's really about making consistent output all the time. And this is plotting many of the ideas around methodologies across that same exact thing. In the top left, you have lean UX, then design thinking, then agile or Scrum or XP, then lean thinking, then DevOps, and then down in the bottom right, I actually put idle in there just to piss everybody off. Because believe it or not, idle does have a place in some enterprises to do some things, especially if you want to guarantee consistent output. And so it really lends itself to 3 different kinds of people you should be thinking about. In the top left, really you're thinking about pioneers, people who are comfortable exploring, they're comfortable with the unknown unknowns. In the middle, you have what's called settlers. So these are people that are really comfortable kind of settling in and productizing stuff. And in the bottom right, we have what's called town planners. And the thing is there is no value judgment here. Each of these are incredibly important, and you need to make sure that you hire good people that are good at whatever they are good at. So you need the town planners, you need the settlers, you need the pioneers, and you need to be able to balance that. And so again, Alicia says, and I'm going to wrap it up now, meaning arises through the interactions between things, not in the things themselves. And so what really matters is the interconnections between the teams, how they communicate or how they don't communicate, and what kinds of cues you're building. Referring back to the Cynefin framework, when we're thinking about moving things from the complex domain down into the obvious domain, this is where you need to think about the interactions that happen between, for instance, the pioneers and the people that are either settlers or town planners, and how things move. And so this is where I combine the Simon Wardley map with the Cynefin framework, and as you can see, along the top hand, you have chaos, complex, complicated, and obvious, and you're moving things from novel practice, that is something that's never been done before, to emergent practice, to good practice, and finally to best practice. Which might sound a little bit strange to you, but there is a place for best practice. It's just not everywhere. When you're discovering completely new things, there are no best practices, and anybody who sells you the idea that there are best practices probably has a consultancy in it trying to make money from it. So the last thing, when we know a process, culture, or organization too deeply, we struggle to view things as they actually are. So here are my thoughts that I want to leave you with. If you want, I'll be around for the rest of the conference. I'll be hanging out. I would love to take questions, but like over beer. Start with your context. Understand the nature of what it is you're trying to do and where you are. Understand what is your technology landscape. What does your stack look like? What are the things that you should be investing in? What are the things that you should be exploring? What are the things you should simply be outsourcing to some third party? Adapt your processes and methods based on your situational awareness. Don't let methods become religions. When in doubt, start small and experiment. Value the interactions and the contributions of everybody, whether they're pioneers, that is heretics, whether they're settlers, whether they're town planners. And think about the whole system, not just your part, not just your team, not just your sprint. The last thing is this. The mindsets and skill sets required for pioneers, as well as the processes and methods deployed, are different than in other domains. It's about the movement between the domains and the interactions between teams across domains where interesting value is created. Expertise, that is high priests, are important, but we can't let it become a trap. There's a thing called expertise entrapment, which is, say for instance, you hire an expert, you give them the problem. They are experts because they have solved problems like that over and over and over again. The downside to it is that they're going to reach into their toolkit and they may come up with the exact same thing that they've done over and over and over again. And sometimes there's value in actually bringing in a newbie, somebody who's never seen that kind of problem before, and pair them with the expert because they bring what's called beginner's mind to the situation. They might be able to see things in a totally different light. And that's why I think that it's important, especially when you're thinking about team formation, about going back to some of the values of XP and about the values of pairing. And it's not just about the expert teaching the junior programmer how to write good quality code. It's also about the junior programmer being able to share their new, completely different mindset with the expert. And the last thing is this. Be pragmatic in your approach to the application of processes and methods. Don't make thought leaders into saints, and don't blindly follow them either. Just because they say something on Twitter does not mean that it came down from God. This is my last slide. Every gambler knows that the secret to surviving is knowing what to throw away and knowing what to keep. So thank you very much. I appreciated your time, and I love being in Poland.